Sammy's Bookshelf. I'm Sammy and today I am going to be showing you all the books that I read in November. I can't believe it's already nearing the end of the year. I'm sure we are all stressing to try and finish our Goodreads goal, so let's get into everything I read in November and also have a little chat about my goals for the end of the year and how many books I still have to read to complete my Goodreads goal before the end of the year. Book I read in November, continuing my tradition of rereading a Cassandra Clare book at the start of every month. I read City of Fallen Angels, which is the 4th book in the Mortal Instruments series. I really enjoyed this book. I actually enjoyed it more than I thought I would. I mean, I knew that I would like the book because obviously I love the whole Mortal Instruments series, but I had forgotten how good this actual individual book is. When I first read the Mortal Instruments, I read all 6 books in a week because I was crazy. So they all kind of blend together in my head and I just forgotten how many great and funny moments are in this book. This book especially has a lot of scenes between Jace and Simon, which were so much fun. I feel like we always see Jace as the really sarcastic and witty one, and when I read this book I realized that Simon is also really witty. Like, he can keep up with Jace in a conversation and they have just such great dialogue together. There are also quite a few iconic Clace moments, and we also get to meet some new characters. We get to see some characters from the Infernal Devices. And what also makes this book really fun is that we can have a bit more of a few lighthearted moments because we're not super deep into the plot of the second half of the Mortal Instruments. And we also get a build-up of what the plot will be for the second half of the Mortal Instruments series. Because while City of Fallen Angels is technically the 4th book in the Mortal Instruments series, it also is technically a first book in a new trilogy. This was just all around a great time. So many great scenes, so much fun dialogue. I gave City of Fallen Angels a 4 out of 5 stars. I did a 48-hour readathon, which you can watch right now, where I read the entirety of the Young Elite trilogy by Marie Lu. I'm not going to go too in-depth on my thoughts on this trilogy because I do discuss a lot of my thoughts as I'm reading this trilogy in my 48-hour readathon video, and I don't want to just be repeating things I've already said. So if you are really interested to hear my super in-depth thoughts, go ahead and watch my 48-hour readathon. I will have it linked in the description. This trilogy is about a girl named Adelina, and she lives in a fantasy world where there has been this blood fever that has swept across the nation. Many died, but the children who survived were left with strange markings. And Adelina is one of the children that survived the blood fever, but she soon learns that the blood fever left more than just strange markings. It also left her with strange but powerful gifts. And Adelina finds herself amongst a group called the Young Elites, with others who have strange powers due to the blood fever. I really enjoyed this trilogy. I loved how dark it was and how unique the main character is in terms of being very morally grey. When you read this book, you never quite know when she makes choices, if she's going to make the good and just choice or become evil, and that's a really intriguing and interesting aspect of this book that keeps you wanting more. And really all these characters in these books are super morally grey, and it just makes them super interesting and really nuanced characters. I did have trouble at times connecting to some of the characters just because they are so morally grey and it can be hard to root for them sometimes. But other than that, I really enjoyed the pacing and how this story progressed throughout the entire trilogy. I gave all 3 books in the Young Elites trilogy a 4 out of 5 stars. After reading the Young Elites, I did take a little bit of break from reading because it is pretty intense reading 3 books in 2 days. But after my break, I started up reading again by reading The Forgetting by Sharon Cameron. This was a book that I started a couple years ago and never finished, but I always intended to finish the story at some point. So I finally got around to finally finishing the book. This book takes place in a city called Canaan, where every 12 years there is what's called the Forgetting, where everyone's memories are erased and no one knows why. The only person who does remember is our main main character Nadia, and her along with a boy named Gray who she is falling in love with throughout this book. She tries to discover the origins of the forgetting and why she's the only person who doesn't seem to forget. I think the premise of this book is super interesting. I also really enjoyed the romance. There were some really sweet and really well written moments between Nadia and Gray, and I was really rooting for them throughout the whole book. However, as I continued to read, I did find myself getting more and more disinterested in the mystery of the book as I went on. So much so that by the time I got to the last 100 pages or so, I was just kind of done with the book. I just wanted it to be finished already. And so I kind of just pretty much skimmed through the last 100 pages. I feel like the reason this happened is because I felt like the premise was so interesting and I was so intrigued by all these questions that were being brought up. However, as the mystery started being revealed, it ended up being not really as interesting as I thought it was going to be. It's something that I've seen in a lot of books before and also a lot of movies. The big reveal just ended up being so generic that it was just very anticlimactic, and so it just made me disinterested in the plot going forward. Because I did skim through the last third of the book, I can't say that I really enjoyed this book, so I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. The second last book I read in November was Defy the Dark by Brigid Kemmerer. This is the first book in a new fantasy series. This book takes place in the kingdom of Kendala, where there is this deadly sickness going around, and the only cure for the sickness is a plant called the moonflower. However, it only grows in certain sectors of the kingdom, and there's never enough to go around. And our main character Tessa, along with her partner Wes, steal moonflower and distribute it to people who can't afford it. It also follows another character named Korik, and he is the king's justice, and he is known for being very cruel. And he is the one who doles out punishment to people like Tessa and Wes who steal moonflower. But one day Tessa finds herself in the palace and Tessa and Korik's worlds collide. I was super excited to get my hands on this book and finally read it because I really enjoyed Brigid Kemmerer's Cursebreaker series, so I was really excited to see what else Brigid Kemmerer had in store for us, and I ended up really enjoying this book. I especially loved the romance. It was definitely my favorite part of this story. The dynamic between Tessa and her love interest was just so much fun and really unique and interesting, and it was so much fun to see their relationship grow throughout the book. This book is also inspired by Robin Hood, which you can definitely tell when you read this book. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this was just how easy it is to read. If you're a person who is often put off by fantasy books because you find them really hard to get into because of all the world building and how complicated it can be sometimes, Brigid Kemmerer's books are a really great intro into fantasy. The world building is very simple. It doesn't take very long for you to just get fully immersed into the story. It would also be great if you're a beginner fantasy reader and you want to get into fantasy but you don't know where to start. Brigid Kemmerer would be a great option. And because of that, I was just always so excited to finally get to reading this book. Whenever I wasn't reading this book, I wanted to be. It was constantly on my mind. And the characters were just always super interesting. I think Brigid Kemmerer is really great at creating really interesting characters that you really connect with. And it's probably because Brigid Kemmerer has written quite a few contemporaries in the past. And obviously contemporary books are fully dependent on the characters and their development throughout the story. I also really want to read Brigid Kemmerer's contemporary books. I know she has a book called Call It What You Want that I really want to read, mainly because it shares a name with a Taylor Swift song, but still. I am super excited for the sequel. This book actually doesn't leave off on a cliffhanger, which I very much appreciate because it will probably be at least another year till the sequel is out. But even though there is no cliffhanger, it still sets up really well for the next book. So I am really interested to see where this story is going to go. There are 1,000 different directions that Brigid Kemmerer could take this story in, so I am very excited to see what she does. I ended up giving this book a 4.3 out of 5 stars. Last but definitely not least, I read Our Violin Ends by Chloe Gong, which is the second and final book in the These Violent Delights duology. If you can't tell from the title, These Violent Delights is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, set in Shanghai during the 1920s, and it follows the characters Roman Montague and Juliet Kai, and they are both heirs to rival gangs, the White Flowers and the Scarlets. And of course, there is a romance between Roma and Juliet, and it also does have some supernatural elements, so it's kind of like a fantasy fantastical historical fiction duology. And of course, it has everyone's favorite trope, enemies to lovers. Our Violin Ends released in November, and I ended up reading it a week after it was released because I like to be on top of these things because spoilers are everywhere, and I ended up really enjoying Our Violin Ends. I thought it was a stronger book than These Violent Delights. I felt like the ending of this duology was super well done, and I was really satisfied with how everything wrapped up. I will say though that if you're going into this duology solely for the romance, you may not enjoy it as much as you might think, just because it is also very political, and the whole politics and historical element of this duology is just as present as the romance, and the romance does sometimes take a backseat to the politics and historical element of this book. And I know personally, when I read the first book, I expected a lot more romance than there actually was, but because I'd read the first book, going into Our Violin Ends, I did know that the politics was going to be more present, and I ended up actually really enjoying that aspect of the book, and just learning about what was going on in Shanghai at the time, because there were all these power struggles, and so it was really interesting to see how all this played out, because obviously even though this book is fiction, it is rooted in truth. I also found it to be really fun to see the parallels between the original Romeo and Juliet and this duology, and to see how Chloe Gong was going to add a specific plot point into the book and how she was going to warp it to fit the story. The only negative I would say about Our Violin Ends is that there were a couple characters that I didn't really care that much about. Every time we had a scene in their perspective, I just wanted to go back to Roma and Juliet, or even Benedict and Marshall. This may have been because it had been a couple months since I read the first book. I had started to forget some of the details, and I did find that the characters I didn't care as much about were the characters that I didn't really remember as well from the first book. So that may have been just a me thing. Overall, I really enjoyed Our Violin Ends. I felt it was a really strong conclusion to a really strong duology. Chloe Gong did such a masterful job of developing this story. I gave Our Violin Ends a 4.3 out of 5 stars. So I ended up reading 7 books in November. Not my best, but not my worst either. I'm hoping in December that I can read at least 8 books. That is how many books I have to read to be able to reach my Goodreads goal. So fingers crossed I can achieve that. Let me know what books you read in November and how many books you want to read by the end of the year to reach your reading goals. And I'll see you next time. Bye!